all the stress you throw at them and never asks for any less stress. We think the productive worker is the.
저희는 지금 디지털 도파민에 중독된 한국인이라는 큰 주제 아래에서 기획 기사를 준비하고 있는데요. 그 해당 기사는 이제 핵심 문제의식이 작가님의 책에서 모티브를 얻어서 현재 한국 사회의 집중력 위기가 도래했고, 이게 개인에게는 문해력 위기, 사회에서는 민주주의 위기 등으로 이어지고 있다는 게 핵심 문제의식입니다. 그래서 작가님의 이제 의견이 저희 기사에 큰 도움이 될 것 같아서 지금부터 좀 인터뷰를 이런 취지 아래에서 좀 시작해 보겠습니다. 네. 그래서 첫 번째 질문인데요. 자매님께서 지금 어떤 좀 활동을 하고 계신 건지 궁금합니다.
I try a few times a year to just go away from my phone and go away from my laptop. So after this interview, I'm giving my laptop to someone else in this village, and I will not be on it for like at least a month. So I try to take long breaks from the internet to kind of restore my attention so I can think more clearly, so I can write better. The reason I do this, and the reason I made many changes in my life, is because we are living in a huge crisis of attention and focus. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than 3 minutes. And for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. And I started working on my book, Stolen Focus, which I'm so thrilled has been reaching such a big audience in Korea, because I could feel this happening to me, right? I could feel that my own ability to focus was getting worse and worse, right? And I realized that things that are so important to me, like reading books, having deep, long conversations, watching films, was just getting harder and harder with each year that passed. Attention is at the heart of all human achievement. So I wanted to understand in my book, okay, what is happening to our attention and how do we get it back? Now, obviously, the solution is not for all of us to give up our laptops and go to Jamaica. That's not a realistic solution. So I want to figure out what can we do in our everyday lives that can get our attention back. And I believe I learned the answer from scientists all over the world.
어쨌든 간에 책에서 언급하신 내용들을 계속 자메이카에서도 이어가시는 것 같은데, 지금 본론으로 들어가서 이게 현재 전 지구적인 집중의 위기의 원인을 뭐라고 지금 진단하고 계시는지가 좀 궁금한데요. 개인에서 이것이 비롯됐다라고 보시는 것인지, 아니면 멀티태스킹을 강요하는 등의 어떤 사회적인 분위기가 더 큰 원인이라고 생각하시는지가 궁금합니다.
And to understand what was going on, I ended up going on a big journey all over the world, from Moscow to Melbourne to Montreal, to interview over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus across the world to figure out, well, why is this crisis happening and what's going on? And what I learned from them is that, in fact, there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. Oh yeah, so you mentioned multitasking. So out of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, I think this is the one where people will most immediately be like, yes, I can see that's happening in my life, right? Although all of the factors will be playing out to some degree. So I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you need to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or at the most 2 things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not changed in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any time scale we're going to see. But what's happened is we've fallen for a kind of mass delusion. The average teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time, and the rest of us adults are not that far behind them. You can't do more than one thing at a time. What you do is you juggle very quickly between tasks. You're like, what did you just ask me? What is this message on WhatsApp? What does it say on the TV over there that just happened? What is this message on Facebook? Wait, what did you just ask me again? So we're constantly juggling. And that juggling comes with a really big cost. The technical term for it, and everyone should know this term, is the switch cost effect. When you try and do more than one thing at a time, you do all the things you're trying to do much less competently. You make more mistakes, you remember less of what you do, you're much less creative. And I remember when I first heard that, thinking, okay, I get it, but that's a small effect, right? It's not a big deal. It's a really big effect. One study, for example, found that being constantly interrupted in the way that we are is twice as bad for your intelligence as smoking cannabis, right? This is really bad for your intelligence, for your ability to think clearly, for your creativity. This is why Professor Miller says we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being constantly interrupted.
그럼 다음으로 넘어가서 이게 전 지구적으로 이제 개인들이 겪는 일들이 어떤 보편적인 부분들을 말씀해 주셨는데 이게 저기 한국적인 상황을 좀 비춰봤을 때는 한국은 특히 이게 높은 스마트폰 보급률이 있고 또 어디서나 인터넷에 접속할 수 있는 환경들을 좀 가지고 있는데 이것들이 집중의 위기가 더욱 심각하게 퍼지는 원인으로 좀 지적되기도 합니다. 그래서 이런 평가에 작가님께서 동의를 하시는지 그리고 이 한국의 상황이 전 세계적인 집중의 위기에서 좀 더 특별한 케이스라고 좀 볼 수 있을지 이거에 대해서 좀 궁금합니다.
I think it's a really important question, and I would need to do more research to be certain. But from my understanding of South Korean society, I think there are actually many factors playing out in your society that are will make this crisis particularly bad. So you mentioned one is very heavy smartphone use. They're quite shocking, the figures, actually. But I actually think there are others as well. One is stress. So we know that stress is really bad for people's ability to focus and pay attention, right? When you are very stressed out, your attention, you develop a state that's known as hypervigilance. So when you're very stressed out, you start scanning for risk and danger, right? You start looking around you for if you're in a stressful environment that you feel is unpredictable, then you're constantly looking out for things that could go wrong. You're anxious, right? That makes it much harder to focus. So I think South Korean society has very high levels of stress. You have the longest working hours in the world, staggering working hours. And that leads also to another factor that really harms attention, which is lack of sleep, right? So I interviewed some of the leading experts on sleep in the world. And there's been a decline in sleep almost everywhere. In the United States and Britain, people sleep about 20% less than they did 100 years ago, which is an extraordinary decline. And Charles Czeisler, who's a brilliant man who's at Harvard Medical School, arguably the most important sleep expert in the world, one of the top ones. And he explained to me, when you go to sleep, something really important happens in your brain. The whole time you're awake, something called metabolic waste is building up in your brain. It's a kind of he calls it brain cell poop, which helped me to understand it, right? The whole time you're awake, this brain cell poop is building up in your brain. And when you go to sleep, a watery fluid washes through your brain and takes this brain cell poop out of your brain, down into your kidneys, and eventually out of your body. If you don't get 8 hours sleep a night, your brain does not get an opportunity to properly clean itself, and it is clogged up. Your brain is slower. If you stay awake for 19 hours, which doesn't sound like very much, your attention deteriorates as much as if you had got legally drunk. And Koreans sleep less than almost anyone else in the world. The figures are extraordinary. So even if we just set aside the smartphone use, although that's a really big factor, stress, lack of sleep, or elements of your childhood, which we
이거에 대해서 추가적인 좀 질문을 하고 드리고 싶은데 이게 지금 지적해 주신 게 어떤 굉장히 스트레스풀한 환경, 우리 사회의 스트레스풀한 환경하고 높은 노동 강도, 장시간의 노동 시간들, 또 어떤 수면 부족 이런 것들이 사실 집중력 위기의 원인들 중에 하나지만 이것이 또 어찌 보면 그 테크 기업들이 만드는 집중력 산업에 우리가 좀 더 빠져들 수밖에 없는, 그러니까 디지털 도파민에 중독되어서 이것이 또 다른 또 집중력 위기로 이어지는 것의 원인이 또 하나가 될 수 있다고 좀 보는데 여기에 대해서도 작가님이 좀 동의를 하시고 여기에 대해서 좀 어떻게 평가를 하고 계시는지도 좀 궁금하거든요.
I think that's a really intelligent and thoughtful point. all these factors interact with each other. We know that at an individual level, right? If you don't sleep tonight, if you get 4 hours sleep tonight, you're more likely tomorrow to spend a couple of hours scrolling through TikTok than if you've got 8 hours sleep and your brain is fresh and you're up for the day. So what's true at an individual level is also true at a social level. But I think what this reveals is, this is true of my own country, Britain, but I think it's particularly true of Korea, is we've developed a really dysfunctional idea about what productivity is, right? We think the productive worker is the worker who will answer their phone, their email at any time of the day or night. And this is really wrong. Even think about that last one, the email. There was a study by Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon that found if you're interrupted by something as simple as an email or text, it takes you on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. But most of us never get 23 minutes without being interrupted. So we're constantly operating at this lower level of capacity, right? So at some level, everyone watching knows this, because, you know, none of you would want the Korean football team at the next World Cup walk onto the pitch, having slept 3 hours the night before, completely stressed out, and with their phone in their hand to check their text messages during the game, right? None of you would want that, right? You all know that would make your team much more likely to lose. Well, if that's true of your football team, that's true of your work team, that's true of you, that's true of your family, that's true of your life. So we have to move, and I find this difficult. I'm not saying this is easy, but we have to move to a very different conception of what productivity is. One that is about healing and restoring attention, helping people to pay attention and to figure out particularly how to pay attention to the things that really matter in life. And that's really the subject of my book, Stolen Focus.
다음으로는 이게 책에서도 좀 말씀해 주셨지만, 이게 아까의 질문하고도 연결되는 부분인데요. 이게 테크 기업들, 뭐 인스타그램이라든지 페이스북, 뭐 메타에서 만드는 SNS들, 그리고 뭐 구글에서 하는 어떤 알고리즘들, 유튜브의 알고리즘, 이런 것들이 사실 집중력 파괴를 사업 모델로 돈을 벌고 있다고 지적을 좀 하셨는데요. 이러한 사업 모델들을 우리가 어떤 관점에서 비판을 해야 될지가 궁금하고, 또한 앞으로 더욱 확장될 집중력 비즈니스에 어떻게 우리가 대응을 해야 될지가 궁금합니다.
The truth is, this crisis is not happening because you had bad habits or I had bad habits. This crisis is happening because of some really big and powerful forces that are doing this to us. And this part of the solution has to be that we go on offense against the forces that are doing this to us. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley interviewing people who designed key aspects of the world in which we now live. And one of the things that most struck me was how incredibly guilty they feel. You know, one of them is an amazing man named Dr. James Williams, who used to work at the heart of Google. If anyone watching or reading your article, if you open now TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, please don't. But if you did, those companies begin to make money out of you immediately in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. We all know how that works. The second way is much more important. Everything you ever do on these apps is scanned and sorted by the artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what makes you tick, right? They're reading everything you do, including your so-called private messages. They're reading everything you say and do. If you like Donald Trump, you're probably right-wing. If you like Dolly Parton, you must like country music. If you just bought some diapers, you must have a baby. It knows tens of thousands of things like that about you. And it's learning these things for a few reasons. But the most important is it's learning what to show you next to keep you scrolling for a very simple reason. Every time you open the app and begin to scroll, they begin to make money. The longer you scroll, the more money they make because the more ads you see. Every time you close the app, their revenue stream disappears. So all this genius in Silicon Valley, all this AI, all these algorithms, when it's applied to social media, is designed to do one thing and one thing only. Figure out How do we get you to open the app as often as possible and scroll as long as possible? That's it. Just like the head of KFC may care about many things, but in his professional capacity, all he cares about is how many times did you go to KFC this week and how many pieces of chicken did you buy? All these companies care about in their professional capacity is how much of your attention did we take today? They have built machines that are designed to harvest your attention. As my friend Tristan Harris, who worked at the heart of Google for years, says, in that situation, you can try having self-control, but every time you do, there are 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen trying to undermine your self-control. Asa Raskin, who invented a key part of how many websites work, his dad, Jeff Raskin, invented the Apple Macintosh for Steve Jobs. He said to me, if you want to know what the lead in the lead paint is like, it's very simple. You need to ban the current business model for social media. And I remember when he first said that, saying, what do you mean, right? And essentially, there are three ways that we can fund social media. The first way is the thing that we do at the moment. The technical term for it is surveillance capitalism, which is a term that comes from the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff. Surveillance capitalism is a very fancy term for a simple thing. It's what we have now. You appear to get TikTok and Facebook for free, but in return, they surveil you, they monitor you, they track you, and they learn how to hack your attention and get you to keep scrolling. So you seem to get it for free, but in fact, you pay for it with your attention, right? That's one model, surveillance capitalism. It's what we have today. So the second possible business model is subscription, right? We all know how Netflix works. You pay a small amount, in return, you get access. The key thing is all the incentives change in a subscription model. At the moment, under surveillance capitalism, all the incentives are, how do we hack and invade you in order to keep you mindlessly scrolling? Because you are not the customer of TikTok or Facebook. They've got customer service departments. You can't find them. I can't find them, right? The customer is the advertiser. We are the product they sell to the customer, right? Our attention is the product they sell to the customer. But suddenly, under subscription, you become the customer. Suddenly, they're asking, not how do we hack and invade you in order to keep you scrolling? They have to go, what do you want in life? Oh, turns out you feel good when you can pay attention. Let's design our app to heal your attention, not harm it. Oh, it turns out you feel good when you meet up with your friends offline. Okay, let's design our app to maximize meeting up offline instead of scrolling through their photos. Easy to do that, right? My friends in Silicon Valley could do it in a week. The key thing is to get the incentives there. So second model is subscription. The third model is something that everyone has experience of. And the fancy term for it would be public ownership independent of government. Think about the sewers. Before we had sewers, we had feces in the street. People got cholera. It was terrible. Not so long ago in Seoul, Korean cities. So everyone in South Korea pays to build the sewers and maintain the sewers together. And you own the sewers along with everyone else in South Korea, right? I own the sewers with everyone who lives in London, my city. Now, it might be that just like we want to own the sewage pipes together because we don't want to get cholera, we might want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera, our attention, our children's attention, and I would argue for our democracy and our politics, but we can come back to that. But the key thing is, unless you change the incentives, nothing will change. For as long as the longer you scroll, the more money they make, they will just get better and better at hacking and invading our attention. It sounds like a big thing. Of course, it is a big thing. But as James Williams said to me, human beings had the axe for 1.3 million years before anyone said, guys, should we put a handle on this axe? The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. We can change how it works if we want to. That's within our power.
간단하게 한 가지만 더 추가로 관련해서 질문 드리면, 이게 어쨌든 간에 저도 굉장히 그 작가님의 말씀에 동의를 하는데요. 또 테크 기업들에 대한 또 강력한 규제가 필요하다 이런 것들은 동의가 되는데, 또 한 가지 측면에서는 이게 단순히 스마트폰을 오래 사용하는 것에 대해서 우리가 이걸 규제를 해야 된다. 정부가 이것들에 강력하게 개입을 해야 된다라는 주장이 사실 어떤 측면에서는 과도하게 기업의 어떤 자유로운 그런 시장 활동을 침해하는 거 아니냐라는 말이 있을 수도 있고, 또 어떤 기술 발전의 어떤 한 측면을 가로막는 것이 아니냐라는 지적도 있을 것 같아서, 여기에 대해서 좀 더 강력하게 그것이 필요하다라고 주장하는 근거를 말씀해 주신다면 어떤 게 있을지 또 궁금합니다.
So, but in terms of profit, I would say there is a threat to profit and there is a threat to innovation. And it's if people can't think clearly, right? At the moment, you know, in some studies, children in schools are struggling to focus for more than a few minutes, right? To have a productive economy, you need to have people who can think clearly, can think deeply, and can think creatively. A group of people who've done nothing but watch TikTok in their childhood are not going to be able to do that, right? So I agree that there's a threat to profit and there's a threat to innovation, but the threat doesn't come from regulating the tech. The threat comes from if we don't regulate the tech, there'll be a huge threat to innovation and creativity, in my view.
그러면 이게 좀 다른 측면이기도 한데, 이게 책에서도 설명된 바들이 있지만 그 집중의 위기가 이게 지금까지 뭔가 사회적 측면에서 좀 더 얘기했다면, 이게 개인에게 미치는 악영향들은 또 추가적으로 다른 측면에서 또 어떤 것들이 있을지, 또 더 나아가서 또 사회적인 측면에서 또 미치는 영향이 또 더 추가적으로 무엇이 있을지 좀 추가적으로 좀 말씀해 주실 수 있을지요.
Yes, there's a few different ways we can think about this. So James Williams, who I mentioned before, who's a really important philosopher of attention, he says that there are 3 layers of attention. I actually think there's a 4th one, and I know he agrees with this because we talked about it. So the first layer of attention is what you call your spotlight. Spotlight is your ability to narrow down your attention to one immediate task. So in the room you're in now, I'm sure that if you could zone out, and you might be able to hear the air conditioning, you might be able to see people going past your window, you can probably see your phone is somewhere in the room, you might be able to look at it and see what's going on, but you're filtering out all of that and you're narrowing down to what I'm saying to you, right? So that's generally, when we think about the problem of attention, we generally think about our spotlight being disrupted. So if I go now to the fridge to get a Diet Coke, and on the way there, my friend texts me and I'm standing in my kitchen and I answer the text, and suddenly I'm standing there, I can't remember why I went there, and I come back to my laptop and I don't have a Diet Coke, right? That would be an example of your spotlight being disrupted. And like I say, mostly when we think about distraction, that's what we think of, right? And that is really a problem, but it's actually only the smallest of the problems that come from attention. So the next level up is what Dr. Williams calls your starlight. And that's not your ability to achieve an immediate goal, like going to the fridge to get a Coke. That's your ability to achieve a long-term goal, like I want to write a book, I want to set up a business, I want to be a good parent, right? It's called your starlight because if you're lost in the desert and you don't know, you haven't got GPS, and you look to the stars and you're like, that's the direction I'm traveling in, right? And he argues we're so jammed up and unable to focus, it's not just harming our ability to achieve short-term goals, it's harming our ability to achieve longer-term goals. Okay, the next level up is what he calls your daylight. And that's not your ability to achieve a long-term goal, that's your ability to even figure out what your long-term goals are. How do you know what business you want to set up? How do you know what book you want to write? How do you know what it means to be a good parent? To get those things, you have to have time to rest. You have to have time to think. You have to be able to talk with people deeply. It's called your daylight because you can see a room most clearly when it's flooded with daylight, right? And he argues that this is also being really damaged, that we are decohering. If you never have time to think properly, it's very hard to even figure out who you are and who you want to be. The next level up is what I would call your stadium lights. And that's not just your ability to achieve your own short and long-term goals. That's our ability as a society to achieve our long-term goals, right? it is not a coincidence that at the same time as this attention crisis, we are having the biggest crisis in democracy all over the world since the 1930s, in countries as different as Britain, Brazil, and Burma, right? Hard to think of countries more different, and yet we're all having this coming apart in similar ways. I know this is playing out in South Korea with fake news, with polarization, with disinformation. So I think actually, and I can talk more about why that's happening and what we can do about it, but I think this is happening at every level of our society. So when at first the attention crisis seems like a small thing, I get distracted so much. But when you look at it in more detail, as I hope I do in Stolen Focus, you realize this is affecting every layer of our lives, from the most trivial to the most grand and collective.
그 태어날 때부터 스마트폰을 보고 자란 세대들을 미국에서는 알파 세대라고 분류를 하는데, 이게 아까도 그 어린 아이들의 문제들을 말씀해 주셨지만, 어릴 때부터 이런 고자극 환경들, 또 이 집중력을 빼앗기는 환경들에 노출되는 이 세대들이, 특히나 한국에서도 특히 어떤 문해력 논란들이 있었습니다만, 이런 것들이 아이들에게 미치는 영향이 굉장히 심대하고 이것이 미래에는 더 큰 위협으로 다가올 것으로 보이는데, 이게 작가님이 생각하시기에는 이 집중의 위기에서 이 아이들이 처하고 있는, 그러니까 디지털 네이티브 아이들이 처하고 있는 어떤 영향들, 그로 인한 그 사회에 파급되는 영향들은 어떤 거라고 좀 생각을 하시는지가 궁금합니다.
I think this is really important, and a lot of my book is about what's happening to our children's attention. And very often, this is framed as if there's something wrong with our kids, right? What's wrong with them? They can't focus. There's nothing wrong with our children. There's something wrong with the environment we have allowed to be created for our children, right? So we need to stop criticizing our children and start criticizing the environment that is harming their attention, right? This is really important. And I have to say, I think South Korea has a particularly big problem with this for a few reasons that are really important to understand. I think what we were talking about before, that mistaken idea of productivity, which is applied to adults, is being applied in a particularly misguided way in South Korea, although it's done with good intentions and with love. So I want to explain that a bit more, but I'll just answer the thing about literacy first. So all over the world, young people are finding it harder to read books. I mean, think about us as adults. We find it harder to read books, and we grew up reading books, right? And there's a range of reasons, but one is, so there's a scientist in Norway who I interviewed called Anne Mangan, a really interesting and important scientist, did some really interesting research on this. So she discovered when you read a book or a printed text in English, you read it from left to right, left to right, left to right, left to right. You read it down, left to right, left to right, left to right. When you read on a screen in English, you don't do that. You can figure this out by monitoring people's eyes as they read. What you do when you read on a screen is you generally read in a Z shape. You read the first line left to right, and then you skim ahead, you scan ahead, and then if you're a few words, and then if you're interested, you go back to the start, right? Now, that's a different way of reading. It's a much faster way of reading and a much shallower way of reading. If you read too much on a screen, and then you're given pages, printed material like a book, it's very hard to go back to just reading left to right, left to right, left to right, you know. So screen-based reading harms your ability if you do too much of it. Obviously, I'm in favor of screen-based reading. I do a lot of it myself. But if it dominates too much of your time, it then becomes harder to do printed reading. And we know that printed reading is better for your memory. There's loads of studies of this. You get a group of people, you split them into two groups, you give them the same text to read. Some of them get it as a printed book and some of them get it on a screen. And then you go back to them a week and a month later and you just ask them questions about what they read. The people who read it on printed are much more remember much more of what they read and have thought about it in a more thoughtful and intelligent way. So we know it's a deeper form of reading. So it's really important that we deal with the attention crisis so that people can continue to read books, which is a very important way of thinking, you know, and reading. But I think in terms of childhood, there's a much deeper thing going on. And there's lots of ways I could explain it. But I think, South Korea is famous or notorious for a particular approach to childhood, a kind of hot housing approach to childhood, where children in South Korea study for far more hours than any other country in the world. And I want to be clear that South Korean parents who do this with their children are absolutely doing it out of love, right? They believe they are genuinely helping their children, and that giving their children this is an act of love. Precisely because it is a form of love, I would urge South Korean parents to look at some of the evidence I put forward in Stolen Focus and some of the wider scientific evidence, because I do not believe this is actually helping your children. And there's lots of reasons why, but one of the heroes of my book is a woman called Lenore Skenazy, who's done a lot of work showing that children, small children and older children right up into their teens, learn primarily by playing, freely playing without adults watching them. The most important form of learning that children do is when they play with other children. And that is how they learn to develop attention. So if you watch kids just playing, if you just let kids go and play, right, and you don't tell them what to do, they make up games, they invent games, they do all sorts of things. But in Korea, and also in Britain, my own country, we have built our school systems around getting kids to memorize meaningless garbage for tests that measure nothing of any value, right? Honestly, if we wanted to ruin our kids' attention, that's what we'd do, right? Education systems that infuse learning with meaning produce children who can pay attention, right? For example, in Berlin, I went to a school called the Evangelische Schule Zentrum that gets the kids to figure out what they want to learn about and then builds all the lessons around the things the kids find interesting. Those kids have much better attention, right? So I think at every level at the moment, Koreans are getting a lot wrong about childhood, but we could begin to fix that if we wanted to. On one side, you've got all these 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, and they are going to become more powerful if we let them. Paul Graham, who's one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, says the world is on course to be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40. That's one side of the race. On the other side, there's got to be a movement of all of us saying, no, you don't get to do that to me. You don't get to do that to my children. Of course, we choose a life with lots of technology, but we also choose a life where we can think deeply, where our children can play outside, where we can read books. Now, if we want that, we can get it, but it requires a big shift in psychology to stop blaming ourselves and start blaming the forces that are doing this to us and stopping them. Because we are not medieval peasants begging at the table of King Zuckerberg and King Musk for a few little crumbs of attention from their table. We are the free citizens of democracies, extremely democracies in the case of South Korea. And we own our own minds. And together we can take our minds back if we want to.
그럼 마지막으로 작가님께서 이게 좀 가장 중요한 질문이라고 저는 생각하는데, 이게 주 4일제를 대안의 중에 하나로 좀 제시를 하셨는데, 이 주 4일제가 지금의 위기를 해결할 수 있다고 생각하시는 이유가 무엇인지 궁금하고, 사실 이게 현실적으로 가능하느냐라는 질문이 계속 있는데, 한국에서도 지금 정치적 의제로도 좀 논의가 되고 있고, 하지만 현실적으로 이게 가능하겠느냐라는 계속 의문점이 있어서, 작가님께서는 이것이 현실적으로 가능하다고 보시는 이유가 무엇인지, 이게 마지막으로 좀 궁금합니다.
Yeah, so I went to New Zealand to see where they had actually done this. And it was really fascinating. And I interviewed people all over the world who'd experienced 4-day work weeks. And to be honest, I didn't really believe the evidence until I saw it for myself. So I'll give you an example. This company called Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand, who moved from a 5-day week to a 4-day week. And it was monitored by Auckland Business School. And it was discovered that they achieved more in 4 days than they had in 5, right? Not per hour, overall, they achieved more in 4 days than they had in 5. And I remember thinking, well, how can that possibly be true, right? That doesn't seem, it seems bizarre. But then it was explained to me by the people there, if you're completely exhausted, if if you don't get to sleep, if you don't get to rest, you don't do your best work, right? We all know that. In a 4-day work week, people get more rest, they get to sleep properly, and it means when they do come to work, they're on top of their game, right? They're up for work, they're ready for it. Think about Japan. So in Japan, Mitsubishi moved from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week, and their productivity went up by 125%, right? From what it had been before. Again, especially in a country like South Korea, where people are working to the point of exhaustion and extreme stress, giving people back a little bit more time massively improves their hour-by-hour productivity. By the way, even if it didn't improve their hour-by-hour productivity, it does, but even if it didn't, I would still be in favor of it, because we are not here to work, right? Work is an important part of life, but work is not all of life, right? So we need to have time to work and time to enjoy life, spend time with our children, go into nature, read books, dance, do all the things that make life worth living, right? We've got to have time to do both. And at the moment, we are way too far towards overwork and not enough towards having a balanced life. So I think this would be true anyway, but I think particularly in an environment where we're constantly online, where your boss can message you at any time of the day or night, it's really important to have time to rest and relax and think and spend time with your children. And that's another element for children. For children to be able to learn attention, they have to have adults in their life who are around them, who see them, who they can see paying attention, who they learn attention from. So there's a big range of factors here, but this is a really important one, I think.
긴 시간 내주셔서 감사하고, 마지막으로 끝내기 전에 간단하게 한국 독자들 도둑맞은 집중력 책을 읽은 독자들에게 짧게 인사말이라도 남겨주시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
Yeah, I'm so excited by all the emails I'm getting from people in Stolen Focus, and it sold like a crazy number of copies in South Korea. I do think because this is a global crisis, but I feel like you guys are like the canary in the coal mine. You're like the most extreme one for so many of these trends. But the good thing about that is it means that even because it's so extreme, your situation, even quite small changes will mean that you start to see improvements in attention quite quickly. So I'm going to come to Korea next year. I'm really excited to see everyone there. And yeah, I really think the fact that your crisis is so bad means that you really have to engage with these issues. And if you do, you'll see really big improvements quite quickly in yourselves and your children.